Hello, Professor Jordy Ayton of Osgoode Hall Law School here, and I'm going to take you through our 3-2-3 model for will planning. It's a simplified structure for taking a client through a will planning process. The 3-2-3 model is based on the premise that for every will, there's a maximum of 3 scenarios. There are 2 types of gifts, and there are 3 parts to a will. Let's start with the 3 scenarios portion of the 3-2-3 model. There are 3 fact scenarios at most for any client. Fact scenario 1 is if the client leaves a surviving spouse. So in other words, the client dies first and the spouse is alive. The second fact scenario is the no spouse scenario. That is, the client's spouse either dies at the same time as the client or before the client, so that at the time of death, the client does not have a spouse, but has descendants, children or grandchildren, etc. And the third scenario is what happens if everyone is gone. The client doesn't have a spouse or any descendants. In the 3-2-3 model, the advisor will take the client through each of those 3 scenarios in turn to plan out what the client wants to do in each of those scenarios. Now, when planning for a scenario, the 3-2-3 model is premised on the basis that really, for clients' purposes, there are only 2 types of gifts that they can make. The first type of gift is an absolute gift. For example, I give $50,000 to John, or I give the house to Susan. The second type of gift is a trust, and that is one that has the word "but" in it. I give $50,000 to John, but if he's under 25, it gets held until he turns 25. Or I give the house to Susan to live in, but when she dies, it goes to Frank. The idea is that an absolute gift has no strings attached. It's the simplest form of gift, and it means that the beneficiary gets the inheritance immediately on death and with no strings attached. The beneficiary can then do whatever he or she wants with the inheritance, including spending it all, giving it away during their lifetime, or making a will that gives it away when he or she dies. The only other option, a trust, determined if the client uses the word "but" when describing the gift. In the previous example, if they said, I want to give money to somebody but not all at once, or I want to control what happens when they die to that gift, then those are both examples of trusts, and they're used for either control, that is determining what happens to that inheritance even after the client is gone, or for protection of the beneficiary, ensuring, for example, that the beneficiary has some restrictions on what they can do with the money. And the last part of a 3-2-3 model is really the concept of what a will looks like. A will is really 3 parts. A funnel that shifts estate assets and non-estate assets, because of course a will only governs what a client has when they die in their own name. Assets that are jointly held or where there's a designation of beneficiary specifically on that asset goes outside the estate. Everything else that belongs to the client at the time of death in their own name alone is part of the estate. So the funnel separates those 2. And then there's the filters. These govern things like payment of debts and any initial gifts that come off the top, like specific amounts or a specific asset. And lastly, whatever's left that is drained through those 2 filters now falls into the bucket, the balance of the estate, also known as the residue. And it contains all of the remaining assets that the person has when they die automatically. Everything that a person has when they die forms part of that bucket. That bucket is typically divided into percentages and given away, either absolutely or in trust, like any other inheritance. And that's the 3-2-3 model. Thanks so much for listening.